Hello, I'm Dr. Musil, and welcome back to Lecture 2 of Logic and Critical Thinking. In this lecture, we turn our attention to an introduction to logic and critical thinking. So in our first lecture, I had us back up a bit, right? One of the things we learned was that our subject is actually one of the primary branches of philosophy, right? One of the four primary branches, as I suggested, right? You take this course, you take it through the philosophy department. So we talked about then what philosophy is in in a more general sense. What is philosophy in general? And so we all had a kind of colloquial sense of philosophy coming into the course, as I suggested, right? But one of the points I mentioned was that, well, that's true. Philosophers are interested in the big T, capital T, truth. Why is there something, not nothing? What happens after we die? Certainly true. But philosophers are also interested in all the little T truths, right? We're interested in truth in general. And again, that's kind of true of our particular subject, right? I mean, it resonates in that sense, and that you can apply everything we're going to talk about, as the editors of our textbook suggest, to seemingly all facets of life, right? And so too, philosophy, right, in its pursuit of the truth, well, that's all aspects of it, okay? Not just the big, deep elements of the truth, but is my my everyday beliefs well founded, right? That sort of thing. Philosophy is interested in all elements of the truth. And then we turned our attention to historical breakdown of philosophy. We went through the four eras of philosophy, and I tried to highlight then what was of most importance to the philosophers in each of those particular time periods. Also gave a categorical breakdown of philosophy, speaking of which, while I'm thinking about it, right? So I noticed after reviewing the first lecture that about halfway through, when I'm trying to, for whatever reason, make it more legible, I guess, I erased what I had there, and then when I rewrote it, it was missing a Y. So for half the lecture, epistemology was missing a Y. So I wanted to acknowledge that. And then also I referenced this course as being Philosophy 121 through Johnson County Community College, when in fact it's Philosophy 124. When I first started making these videos, I would have contemplated like redoing the entire lecture video then, but if you're one who's done something similar, recorded videos like this, you quickly realize you'd never post any videos then, because they're never going to be perfect. So just wanted to acknowledge those two issues or mistakes I made in the first lecture. But anyway, we went through a categorical breakdown of philosophy in general. We talked about metaphysics, epistemology, right? And you can have, entire, courses, right? Not only about metaphysics, but then in particular aspects, philosophy of mind, not only then, particular aspects of metaphysics, but then you can hone in on a particular author or a particular book by a particular author. So we went through and kind of characterized these general categories, though. Talked about metaphysics, epistemology, ethics. That's probably one that maybe a lot of us are most familiar with. Of all these the branches of philosophy, we're all pretty familiar with right and wrong, good and evil, these kinds of ideas. Now, whether they're very well justified, or if we have a good grasp of what we mean by them, that's another issue entirely, right? And that's why you can take an entire course on ethics to try to figure out, whether you can discern what it is you actually mean by, suggesting somebody was right to do something. But anyway, that's what ethics is all about, those sorts of issues. And then we talked obviously about how logic, critical thinking, our subject then, is one of the primary branches of philosophy. And so that's then what we turn our attention to in this particular lecture, right? We'll turn to in more detail to what it is we're going to be doing for the remainder of the course. Okay, so that's the objective here in lecture 2. So again, this will actually correlate to then chapter 1 of the textbook, if you're taking the course, right? So we're talking about very general stuff here. None of this is too difficult, I would say. It's pretty straightforward, especially when juxtaposed to the stuff we'll get into, especially in section 2. Not difficult at all, but it is incredibly important in the sense that you got to have a good grasp of it, because everything else, and I think I alluded to this in the first lecture, everything else that we'll talk about for the rest of the course is built on this fundamental stuff, and having a good relatively good grasp of it. So again, we're going to go through a lot of the conceptual framework upon which everything else that we'll then discuss for the remainder of the course is going to be built upon. Okay, so we'll tease out, a difference between critical thinking in general and then logic and what it means to be doing, assessing logic or talking about logic. Outside of the course, one of the things I've been trying to intimate here, in general, when we reference logic or critical thinking, right, they're somewhat pretty much synonymous. Okay? And when I reference logic being a category of philosophy, I mean more generally critical thinking as well. But for our purposes, right, since this is our specific subject that we're going to be spending the rest of the course talking about, it's of interest to us to actually tease out that there is a difference, right, and that this actually has a pretty precise technical meaning, okay, and that it's not quite as general, maybe, if you're being precise about things. It's not the connotation, at least for our purposes, right, that we associate what we mean by logic. It's not quite the same thing as critical thinking. So we'll tease that out. We'll talk about the relationship again amongst or between these two then in philosophy more generally, as I've tried to suggest in the first lecture and what I've been suggesting here so far. Philosophy in some sense, or what we're doing is sort of the method of philosophy, right? Philosophy is concerned with the truth, and what we're going to see is that critical thinking and logic are also concerned with the truth and, offering us sort of tools to then better get to that truth. And so, I think it's of interest again to stress that in some sense, and we'll again articulate this as we move forward, that these are really the tools of philosophy then more general, or more generally. And then we'll talk about beliefs and claims and what we're going to mean by these terms and what it means to be dealing with the claim and why that's particularly important for us. We'll flesh out the importance of something being objective versus subjective claims, right? Objective and subjective issues. Okay, so and we'll talk about in some sense why what we're really going to be dealing more with and what it makes more sense for a critical thinker to spend his time on are objective issues, right? It doesn't make as much sense to debate the truth of whether a particular book was any good or whether a particular painting is beautiful or so on, right? Subjective issues. How do you provide evidence for that? So that's one of the things we'll talk about, and how instead we're going to be more concerned typically with this. And we'll talk about then what an issue is. As we'll suggest, it's basically going to be raising a question. It's anything about which you can raise a question. Is abortion okay? Is the death penalty okay? Yes or no, right? And so another thing we'll talk about then is when you take a position or take a stance on an issue, what you have then, right? So if you take a stance, okay, position or stance, so an issue is just a general sort of question. So is abortion right? Is there life after death? Whatever, right? Basically anything literally we can raise a question about, okay? And then you can take a stance, right? Or have a position with respect to that issue then. And what we're going to talk about then, in a very general sense, is how when dealing with arguments, this then is going to correspond to what we would call the conclusion. So if the death penalty is inappropriate, your stance is no. Well, if you're offering an argument, the idea is that would be your conclusion, and then hopefully you're giving us at least some reason, right, or and hopefully good reasons then for thinking that. But the point here is when we take a position or stance on an issue, right, we'll see that then is indicative of a conclusion in an argument. And so we'll talk about arguments as well, the basic ingredients. We're going to not dive into arguments in too much depth yet. That'll be the central focus of the next lecture. Then lecture 3, we'll turn our attention to arguments in much more detail. We'll talk about how to identify them and how to assess them. What the two main kinds of arguments. But in this lecture, at the end of this lecture, we'll just talk about what the two main ingredients of an argument, what they are, and sort of how to discern whether there's an argument in a very general sense. Again, we'll save a lot of the detail for the next lecture. And then we'll end this lecture by talking about psychological or cognitive biases, which are really fascinating. So basically our science and psychology in particular over the years, the research has suggested, and it's fascinating in the sense that it's suggesting that so much of what we believe and think and do, we seem to be completely unaware of it, and we just do it automatically. And I guess, part of the job, the upshot here, and a lot of what I'm going to say is part of the job of philosophy then is to draw attention to that, turn on the light, so to speak, and enlighten us to a lot of the cognitive and psychological biases that so many of us would otherwise be susceptible to, and sort of make that process of coming to our beliefs and actions a more critical process, right? Hopefully, right? And again, one that we more explicitly bring into focus. Okay, so I think in some sense, again, the job of what the philosopher is doing in general is drawing our attention to this kind of stuff. Look at how so much of what we tend to think is true is really just guided by customary beliefs, right? That we have sort of no conscious awareness of. It's just almost instinctual. Again, philosophy and logic and critical thinking, if you will, it draws our attention to these cognitive and psychological biases that would otherwise seemingly we would be completely unaware of. Okay, so that's the game plan for the lecture. Let's go ahead and then dive into it. I think I got all my bookkeeping points out of the way. So we're going to turn to slide 2 again. Why are we here? We're here to study critical thinking, which again is associated with logic. There is this connection here, and outside of the scope of this course, right? If we were in an everyday average conversation, these would be perfectly fine. Would be fine using them synonymously. Okay, but one of the things I'm going to try to suggest here, right, is that we're going to use them in a much in a distinct way. Critical thinking is going to be more broad. It covers again drawing our attention to how it is we arrive at our beliefs and our decisions, in a sort of general sense. Whereas logic, as we'll see in a moment here, right, it's going to be dealing technically, if you're precise in how you're defining it, it technically has to do with something very specific, namely with respect to the beliefs you have or the positions you have, okay, the conclusions you have in an argument, right, the reasoning you have for them, how good is it, okay? So in an argument, right, the logic part is specifically concerned with the connection between the reasons given or the justification given for believing something and then that belief itself or that position itself. How well do these actually connect, right? That's the point of emphasis for logic in particular. Okay, because you can spell out all these reasons for thinking something, but if they're completely irrelevant to your position that the death penalty is wrong, what do they matter, right? So again, you can offer your reasons being my instructor's wearing a blue shirt, the sun is out, therefore the death penalty is wrong. Okay, you offer reasons, they're terrible, right? So logic is all about assessing the connection, okay, between our evidence, if you will, in a general sense, for our beliefs, and then in that conclusion sort of sense, right, the stance we're taking on issues. The connection between what we have for evidence, if there's anything at all, and then our positions themselves, okay? And it's drawing attention to that. Critical thinking is more general, it's more broad in scope. And so turning to slide 3, I thought it would be of interest then to try to offer a few different ways of couching, what critical thinking amounts to or characterizing it. So I've worked with several iterations of our textbook. I think the current one is the 13th edition. Before that, I was working with the 10th edition. Before that, I worked with the 9th and other previous editions. And so throughout the different iterations, the authors have actually, it's been interesting seeing how this has kind of progressed, but they've, how they've couched or characterized critical thinking slightly changed. And so I like, the various ways. I think it would be of interest to hear all the different ways you can kind of think of critical thinking. So what is critical thinking? In the 9th edition, they suggest it's, quote, the careful application of reason and the determination of the truth of a claim. And they say, quote, we think critically when we rationally evaluate our own or others' thinking. And that's from the 10th edition. And then from the 13th edition. So this is from Roman numerals, it's 18. Quote, critical thinking is aimed at making wise decisions about what to think and do, end quote. So that's basically exactly what I just suggested a moment ago. Also from our edition, quote, critical thinking kicks in when we evaluate beliefs and actions, when we critique them. Critical thinking is thinking that critiques. And then from 4 of our textbook, ultimately, quote, the purpose of thinking critically is to come to correct conclusions, end quote. Okay, so what do we want to take from this? In general, right, it's coming to the truth, trying to think more critically about what it is that we are, again, thinking and believing, and also then doing behaviorally. Right? Bringing that process, if they're, a lot of times it's all subconscious. We're not even, there is no process, explicit process, right? Bringing that more to light, and then if there are problems like biases and so on, right? Hopefully getting rid of those. Right? So critical thinking is interested in all that in a very broad sense. So we get this notion of reasoning. What is reasoning? So turning to slide 4, the way they spell it on page 2 of our text, the 13th edition, they say, quote, the thinking that comes into play when we form opinions, make judgments, arrive at decisions, develop plans, come to conclusions, offer hypotheses, and the like. Okay. Now, so the thinking, a lot of times we immediately assume that that's like a conscious process, but I think part of what we're going to mean here is that it's not necessarily, right, a conscious process, something that's explicit. We can have terrible reasoning, especially if we're susceptible to the biases that the editors talk about at the end of the chapter 1. And so don't assume, right, that reasoning automatically, it's automatically a good thing, right? We tend to think of, well, something is reasoned, right? It's explicit, it's something that's thought out and so on. No, what we mean is whatever process you had to come to the beliefs and behaviors that you did, right? Whether that was something that was critically done and self-reflective or not, right? Which is oftentimes the case, it's not, okay? So hopefully that kind of makes sense. In general, critical thinking amounts to critiquing reasoning, okay? So we're drawing, again, critical thinking, what we're up to in this course, we're drawing attention to that process whereby, whether it's typically explicitly or not, we come to the beliefs and behaviors that we end up, thinking and doing. Hopefully that makes sense. Ultimately, as they say on page 2 of the text, quote, critical thinking is reasoning evaluation. So talking again about how critical thinking relates to reasoning and what we mean by reasoning. Again, from page 2, quote, this book and the course you are using it in, if you are, explain the minimum criteria of good reasoning. Okay, so we're going to outline, right, we're going to draw our attention to reasoning in general, how it is people come to the beliefs and behaviors they come to thinking and doing. Right, we're going to draw attention to that, and we're going to outline what good reasoning would look like. Okay, what that should look like, right? What would it mean to be defensible, right? What it means to have a defensible position, i.e., you had good reasoning to get there. Okay? Now, turning to slide 5, and analyzing this, okay, we're then implicitly also going to be analyzing logic insofar as we're dealing with arguments. Okay, so this, in some sense, just reflects the reasoning, right? It's indicative of, again, how it is that someone comes to believe or take the positions they do about things, right? Or it's the process involved in logic assesses the process involved in deciding to do whatever it was they did or take the stance on whatever issue that they took. Okay? So we're interested in this connection and whether it's any good. Okay? And so that is kind of this idea of reasoning in general, right? How it is we're getting here now. A lot of times, again, people do all this, what it is they believe in, it's all sort of subconscious, or it's not something that it's even explicit for them, right? But in what they do and what they say, nonetheless, there's arguments implied, right? If you will, we can extract and talk about, implied in their behavior, what their reasons must have been, and so on. And so you can infer, even when it's not an explicit process, what sort of reasoning must have been involved for someone, and then you can talk about whether it was any good or not. Okay. So, how do the editors tend to talk about logic? The authors say, this is from 484 of this edition, 13th edition. They define logic as, quote, the branch of philosophy concerned with the principles and criteria of inference. That's another buzzword you might hear, inference. You know, what gives us license to come to this position, right? Given all this, what do we have license to infer, right? So again, this is another kind of word that signals this connection. Okay? So in the 10th edition, they define logic as follows, quote, the branch of philosophy concerned with whether the reasons presented for a claim, if those reasons were true, would justify accepting the claim. Okay. So as I mentioned on the top of slide 6, the idea is that logic is concerned specifically with how much relevant support there is that's offered as proof in an argument, typically, right? Whereas critical thinking is more general in scope. Hopefully that's pretty clear at this point, right? We're interested more generally with evaluating claims and reasoning in a more broad sense. Right? So, and the point at the bottom of slide 6, I've been mentioning this, okay? Critical thinking and logic, these are vital to philosophy. They are in some sense, its essence, what it does, right? It's philosophy applied to life. Right? It's how we do philosophy. Right? We turn a critical eye to whatever to discern the truth about whatever. Okay. I also wanted to spend a little bit of time turning to slide 7. So a lot of times in philosophy courses, not so much this one. I think this one, it's pretty clear. How useful, it'll turn out to be very clear at least, how useful this can really be. But in a lot of philosophy classes, is this really happening or is this all going on in my mind? How is this useful? Inevitably, I'll get the question, how is this beneficial? But as I suggest in those very abstract metaphysical sorts of with respect to those issues, even when you don't have a discernible answer to some of these questions, philosophy is still beneficial, and thus its method, if you will, logic and critical thinking is still beneficial because it's sort of training us to properly pursue the truth, if you will, right? To be more critical in how we proceed so that we're not, for example, so susceptible to cognitive biases. Okay? The authors speak to how widely applicable what we're up to is as well. So, the method of philosophy or philosophy in general, how this really does affect, every aspect of our lives seemingly. And so getting back to the general point, hopefully you can already sort of see how this is going to have a huge impact potentially on your life, so it should be much clearer at least than it might be if we were discussing metaphysical issues or something like that, or whether God exists or why there's something in that nothing. But like I suggested, even with respect to those, as we're training ourselves to think critically about them, I still think that's beneficial, right? Because it's again encouraging us to practice and it's sort of ingraining in us these habits then to be more critical in how we proceed. And that should be especially or particularly obvious though in our class where we are going to literally apply this philosophy to issues in our everyday life constantly throughout the course. So as the authors point out, the editors, or the authors I should say, the authors point out in our text, so our subject and what we will learn about for the remainder of this course, quote, apply to nearly any subject people can talk or think or write about, end quote. And then that was from page 3, and then page 22 they say, quote, every discipline, every walk of life, every enterprise without exception involves the two kinds of reasoning we will begin examining in the next chapter. Okay, so we'll talk about the two types of arguments and associated reasoning processes. Right? That'll be, again, the subject of our next lecture, lecture 3, the subject of chapter 2 in the text. Okay, and they're suggesting there that these are implicit in everything we do, this sort of reasoning, whether, again, it's something that we're consciously aware of or not. It's involved in pretty much everything we do. So, again, the bottom of slide 7 just then speaks to the import or the significance of philosophy then and its method, right? How that, regardless of whether we get the big T, truth or the answers to the big questions, it's still beneficial to us. Philosophy is in its method, insofar as it's helping us, right, more clearly discern, let's say, all the lowercase t truths, right, the truths in our everyday lives that we can come to find out, right? It helps us to more clearly see those as well. Okay. Hopefully some of this is making sense. So let's turn then to slide 8, where we'll talk a little moment about beliefs and claims and kind of what we mean by that. So as I mentioned at the top of slide 8, belief is exactly like it sounds. It just signals something that you're convinced of, okay? Something about which you've reached, conclusion, okay? Now, again, this might be something that wasn't necessarily a conscious process, okay? As the authors point out on page 4, quote, when we come to a conclusion, we have a belief. And, quote, it is important to understand that the belief is propositional, okay? It can be propositional, and that then is sort of how it relates to what we mean by claims. So a belief, it's sort of something you believe, something you sort of take a stand on, okay? Now it's propositional in that sense, in the sense that it then can be either true or false, okay? So that's the point I raised at the bottom of slide 8. Okay, so when we call these propositional, what we mean, the important point is, it's something about which, right, or it's something that can either be true or false. You can be right or wrong in that belief, or having that belief. Now, a claim, all we mean to suggest by this, so ultimately we're really going to mean the same thing in some sense, but a claim is kind of making, if you want to have a sort of nuance or tease out the nuance difference here, a claim is kind of the belief made more explicit, okay, and where typically, if somebody's claiming something, they're making this more explicit and recognizing, right, that yes, it is something that can be true or false, and I'm saying it's true, right? It's a more explicit process, if you will. So, and that's what I mentioned in the bottom of slide 8. So it's an expressed belief or opinion that is either true or false. Okay, they talk about that on page 4 of the textbook. Let's spend a moment and turn our attention to this issue of objective versus subjective, claims and issues. Okay, so what is the difference here? What is an objective? Let's start with an objective claim. Okay. So what's an objective claim? They define it on page 5 of the text as follows. Quote, and I think this is a great definition. Quote, whether it is true or false is independent of whether you or anyone else thinks it is true or false. End quote. So whether it is in fact true or false, it doesn't matter what you think or what I think. Okay? There just is a truth to the matter, okay? And it doesn't hinge on our beliefs. Okay? Whereas a subjective claim then, whether it's true or false, is going to depend on who you ask. And it's in that sense where it doesn't really make a lot of sense then to debate them, does it? I mean, again, whether that's beautiful, it's true if you ask me, but it's not true if you ask Sally. And is there really a sense in which you can definitively argue that one person's right and the other person's wrong when it comes to issues that are subjective, right? And so that's what I was intimating earlier when I was suggesting that for the most part, right, when we talk about applying logic and thinking critically and so on, most of what we're going to be dabbling with is objective in nature, right? Because we want to discern truth regarding it, and it doesn't make as much sense to talk about there being truth to the matter when you're dealing with subjective claims and issues. Okay? So again, what is a subjective claim? Whether it's true or false, depends on who you ask. And so, is there any sense in which it's ultimately true or false? Okay, that's kind of the issue here, and that's the sense in which it doesn't make any sense to talk about there being, you can provide evidence for it. Okay? The authors talk about that as well, and we'll reiterate that here in a moment. So one example that's always been helpful for me, that I'll point out in the middle here, is, take, for example, the 49ers play in San Francisco, which, ironically, given the coronavirus right now, they were literally this week, just informed, given the state policy, that they can't practice or play. Right? There's no physical contact allowed in sports in California. So they're actually going to be playing, I think, in Arizona for the rest of the season. Anyway, so the 49ers play in San Francisco. That is an objective matter that was true, at least up until this week, and now might be false, right? But it's an objective claim, one that is either going to be true or false, and it makes sense to talk about there being the sense in which we can provide evidence for it either being true or false, okay? Versus, here's an example of a subjective claim. The 49ers are boring to watch, okay? So that's not something about which, whether it's true or false is independent of us as thinkers, right? We can have one person say it's true and another person say it's false at the same time, and, who's to say one is more correct than another? Now, it's not to say you can't have arguments regarding subjective issues, but, in some sense, how would you ultimately decide those, okay? So I guess hopefully that point's clear. You can still have an argument, right, and engage in debate about whether the 49ers are boring to watch. And, there's still some sense in which somebody can maybe give is there a sense, I guess, in which somebody can give a lot better argument for their position? Maybe they give a lot more reasons at least. But there is a sense in which, right, and I guess this is the point we really want to hammer home. There is a sense in which, an important, critical sense in which the 49ers play in San Francisco is different from the 49ers are boring to watch, okay? A distinct, discernible, meaningful difference, right? We can judge the truth of the 49ers playing San Francisco in a way that we can't the 49ers are boring to watch, okay? We can provide evidence for the former, that they play in San Francisco, in a way that we can't for the 49ers are boring to watch, okay? And that's the main point that the authors were trying to hammer home, and that, you want to take out, or one of the main points I would say that you want to take out from this discussion of objective versus subjective claims, okay, and issues. And it can be, so the bottom of slide 9, it can be tricky sometimes discerning these, especially when you're dealing with, as the authors pointed out, claims about what other people believe, okay? Because we know, so it's one thing to say that is beautiful, okay? That's subjective. But it's another thing to say most people think that is beautiful. That's actually an objective claim, right? It's something about which we could gather evidence. We could go and poll people, okay? So you got to be able to tease out that difference, right? That is beautiful versus most people think that is beautiful, okay? The first one was subjective. The second one is objective, and that's what they're getting at on page 6 of the text. Okay? And they provide, as I mentioned on the bottom of slide 9, a useful example when they suggest, quote, right, so this is their example of an objective claim that sometimes might be easily construed as subjective. So it's actually objective. Quote, other people won't think that outfit looks good on you. Okay, notice how that's different than that outfit doesn't look good on you. Okay, that's subjective, but other people won't think that outfit looks good on you. That is something about which you can gather evidence. You could go ask people, what is their opinions? What are their opinions, right? And, this could then either turn out to be true as supported by the evidence, or false. Then if we go out and quiz everyone and there's nobody that thinks that outfit doesn't look good on you, then that's false. Okay? So hopefully that's starting to make some sense there. And I guess I kind of got into everything on slide 10, at least the main point on the top, okay? We're going to be dealing more with objective claims and issues. They're more, it makes more sense to think of them as being something about which we can have some degree of truth or some notion of truth. The way the authors put that, so this is on the bottom of slide 10 from page 5 of the text. They say, quote, because a subjective judgment cannot be viewed as probably true or as probably false, it isn't the sort of thing that can be thought of as supportable by evidence. Evidence is something that raises the probability a claim is true. Subjective judgments are not susceptible to varying degrees of probability, end quote. So that's another way that the authors themselves put it. Again, that was from page 5. Turning our attention then to this idea of an issue. And we want to be clear here, okay, what an issue is versus one's position on an issue. And we will get into this in more detail in subsequent lectures and subsequent chapters in the text. Okay? But students, no matter how much I try to emphasize this at the outset, we'll still conflate when answering, for example, what is the author's position on the issue? They'll still say the issue, right? Or when trying to say what is the issue, they'll state the author's position instead on the issue. No, the issue, right, is just the question that's at play, right? Is abortion wrong? Is there life after death? Okay? Should I turn that fan on? Should I take a drink of water? Literally anything about which you can raise a question and then, in some sense, have a debate, right? That's an issue, okay? So the authors, as they suggest on page 7 of the text, an issue is a question regarding whether a claim is true or not. From the 9th edition, they say, quote, when we think critically about a claim, we call it into question and make it an issue. Also keep in mind, as I've been suggesting, right, this objective versus subjective distinction, just as it applies to claims, okay, well, it applies to the issues then too, right? So that is beautiful, right? That's a claim that could, in some sense, be the conclusion of an argument, right? It's your stance on whether or not the issue would then be, right, is that painting beautiful? Okay, well, that is a subjective issue. Just like we have subjective claims, well, then we can have subjective issues, right? Is the painting beautiful? That's subjective. Do most people think the painting is beautiful? That's objective. Okay, taking the earlier claim, right? What would be the related issue? Where do the 49ers play? Or do the 49ers play in San Francisco? Okay, that's an objective issue. Are the 49ers boring to watch? Subjective. Okay. Now, this is a point they don't seem to emphasize at least as much in this edition as they did in previous editions. They still speak to it a little bit, but they took out some good examples though. So they do mention, as critical thinkers, it doesn't behoove us to, how do I want to say it, take on any claim, to take on any issue, right? Because if we entertain anything, well then, we'll always be thinking critically. We'll never get to anything because we'll have to entertain things like there's a three-headed purple monkey, flying around Mars, or even, I mean, that's actually not too bad, but take things that are even nonsensical, like some examples. The examples that they give that I wish they hadn't taken out. So these come from the 9th edition. Like, it wouldn't make sense for us to spend any time on a claim like this. Carbostats always contain at least one gym pixel. I mean, what does that mean? Right? We can't even discern what it would mean for that to be true. So it doesn't make any sense for us to spend any of our time, right, analyzing it any further. Or another example, the color blue weighs more than 4 pounds. What does that even mean? It's unintelligible. So the point here being, part of critical thinking is sort of reflecting on and discerning what's worth our time to begin with, right? And we should only take seriously, if you will, right, legitimate claims and issues in the first place. And so, hence the heading of slide 12. Okay. So, and in order for it to make sense, we have to have some means by which to determine if it's true, or we have to, more basically even, we have to have some means to even understand what it would mean for it to be true or false. Okay. Maybe it's the case, the first example I gave, the three-headed purple monkey, orbiting Mars. That's not as bad as some of these other ones because, at least in theory, we know what it would amount to know whether that was true or false. And in theory, we could figure that out, someday. I still would argue that we have to, cut things off at some point with respect to those types of claims. But then take these other nonsense sort of claims where we don't even know what it would mean for it to be true or false. You can't waste any of your time on that, right? So hopefully that's pretty clear. Okay, now what I want to do for the last portion of the lecture, as I suggested I would at the outset, is talk a little bit about arguments. And again, we will spend a lot more time in the next lecture, lecture 3, talking about arguments after all the lectures titled arguments. Okay? But we do want to talk here at the outset, before we then go into more detail in the next lecture, talk a little bit about what an argument is. Okay, and again, there's going to be 2 basic building blocks. So you're going to get used to me doing stuff like that. I mentioned, right, how logic has kind of a mathy feel. I mentioned this in prior videos, right? Well, even how we present arguments, I mean, that looks like a math problem, okay? Premise, right? Premise 1, premise 2, conclusion. The idea being, take these together, add them up, and they equal, if you will, then the conclusion, okay? Or, you know, in a deductive argument, a valid deductive argument, the idea is, if these are true, then you can't help but come to this, right? In some sense, they equal or amount to this. Okay, so when, you know, what is an argument? It emerges, right? We actually have an argument when we're given reasons for thinking or taking a position on an issue. Excuse me. So remember, an issue is anything about which we can raise a question, okay? It's the question in general, okay? Is there life after death? Okay, so then an argument would be any instance where we have a position taken, so we have an answer to the issue, right? A position taken regarding the issue. Yes, there's life after death. Okay? But it doesn't matter how loudly one screams, yes, there's life after death, or abortion's so wrong. It doesn't matter how vehemently they might express that position. That's not good enough. Okay? I'll even throw on a bunch of exclamation marks. Not an argument. Still not an argument. What you need are reasons then given, some sort of evidence on offer for coming here. Okay, if all you have is the expression of a position on an issue, that's not an argument. Okay? Again, no matter how often it's repeated or how loudly or boisterously it might be expressed, you need both ingredients. So too, you might get something that seems like it's a premise or a reason for thinking something, but if there's no position articulated, right, a conclusion or a stance on an issue expressed, okay, then you only have what seems like a reason for thinking something without the person actually taking a position. Okay, so you need both ingredients. As the authors suggest in the 9th edition, arguments, quote, are the single most important ingredient in critical thinking, and, quote, determining whether arguments are any good and whether something that looks like an argument really is one will take up the bulk of the rest of this book. Okay. So, and we will be fleshing this out in much more detail, particularly, you know, for the rest of the course, and particularly in the lecture that follows. Slide 14 is me basically, again, articulating what I just mentioned about there being the 2 basic building blocks, right? Premise is a fancy logic word or critical thinking term for the reason given for taking a position. You can have, for an argument, you just need one. You might have 1,000 reasons given, but you just need one, okay? And to have an argument. Now, it might be a terrible argument, but that's a different issue, right? Whether or not there is an argument, all you need is one premise, right? And again, you might have a whole slew of them, or you could have 10,000 of them. Arguments come in all sorts of shapes and sizes. You know, I'm going to give you an example here in a moment where, yeah, you have an argument in one sentence where there's 2 distinct sort of claims being made, actually 3. You know, so there you have a version of an argument where it's, you know, one sentence. Here, I happen to have this book handy. What is it? Plato's Phaedo. You know, philosophy books in general oftentimes can be construed as one long argument for a particular stance. Or the example oftentimes we'll give is like John Stuart Mill's Utilitarianism, his book called Utilitarianism. That is in some sense, you know, one big argument for why utilitarianism is the correct moral position or moral theory that we ought to uphold. Okay, so you can have an argument, you know, you read an argument, you can have one voiced. Okay, so there's different mediums through which arguments can be expressed. And you probably knew all this, coming into the course, but I think it's still worth pointing that out, right? That we come across arguments all the time. And, especially in philosophy, it's all about arguments, but in your everyday life, you're coming across arguments all the time, but you're also sometimes coming across things that you take to be arguments which actually aren't, right? It's just somebody saying what amounts to a position over and over and over without actually offering anything that resembles, reason for thinking that or taking that position. Okay, so again, arguments take on all sorts of shapes and sizes. We see them all the time. But what is needed to have an argument? At least one, if not more, premises or reasons for taking the position. And then the position on the issue is that fancy word, right? The conclusion. And you need at least one, if not 100 million premises. And you need a conclusion then, the position on the issue that the person, whoever's expressing or writing the argument, the position they're taking on the respective issue then. Okay. In the author's words, so this is how they define it in the glossary at the back on page 485, they say, what's a premise? Quote, the claim or claims in an argument thought to support or demonstrate a conclusion, right? It's whatever's offered here to support or demonstrate or prove a conclusion. So whether it supports or demonstrates, right, that's a difference there. That's going to then hint at, right, previewing the next lecture, the two different kinds of arguments we're going to talk about. One of them entails this notion of necessity. If these are true, this has to follow. Whereas the other type of argument, inductive argument. So the first is deductive. The other type of argument, inductive argument, right? These are just thought to support, not necessitate or prove or guarantee the conclusion is going to be the case, but just support. It's make it more likely. Okay. So one way or another, though, the premises are, whether it's in an inductive argument or a deductive argument, they're giving us reasons for thinking that this is the case. Okay. And what's a conclusion? Again, it's just a claim that's supported by the reasons or the premises given. As they define in the 10th edition, quote, the claim for which a premise is supposed to give a reason, end quote. Okay. I do want to mention, and so they allude to these as well, that we have indicator words, and I'll try to emphasize this, that we also have indicator words for discerning whether we're dealing with a deductive or inductive argument. We'll talk about indicator words for that in lecture 3, but we also have then indicator words for what might be a premise and also a conclusion. So in other words, if you hear these buzzwords, right, that should be signaling to you, hey, a premise is about to follow, or this is likely suggesting that they're offering a reason for thinking whatever their position is. Okay. So what are some common premise indicators? Since, you ought to do this since, right? They're going to give you the reason for doing that. For, because, that's a very common one, right? You better close the garage door because it gets really cold out this time of year. Right? Because, signaling the reason given. In view of, this is implied by, given, on account of the fact that, okay, that's signaling a premise. Okay? And these are, again, oftentimes, they're very common, so they're kind of buzz phrases or buzzwords. They're common. They should signal to you, okay, the author, whoever's expressing this, is giving me a reason to believe their conclusion. The authors of the textbook talk about these premise indicators on the box on page 38 of the text. We also have conclusion indicator words. It works the same way, except this time what should be signaled is that their position on an issue or on the issue is going to be expressed, right? So it's not signaling a reason for the position that they're going to give, but it's signaling the position itself, right? So when you hear these words, this is typically indicative of the stance the person's taking on the issue, and not the reason for taking the stance, but the stance itself. Okay, so, and these are detailed on the box on page 37 of the textbook. So therefore, it follows that, thus, this shows that, hence, consequently, accordingly, so, my conclusion is, that's pretty obvious, right? When they come out and just say their conclusion is, that's probably an indicative of their conclusion. We may conclude that, same thing there. As a result, that's a common one, right? So as a result, comma, oftentimes then if that person's detailing an argument, as a result, comma, whatever follows that, that's usually the conclusion of the argument and that stance that they're taking. Okay, so basic indicator words. I want to do real quick, again, we're not going to do too much more with arguments right now, but I wanted to go through a quick example. I mentioned I did this real quick. Give you an argument that is actually given in one sentence. So bear with me here as I get this up here. Ding, 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 ding. Okay, almost done here. Okay, if I had a bigger board or chalkboard in classroom, then I'd have like room down here where we tease out what the premise is and so on. So take a moment, don't look at the slide yet. So I'm on slide 16, by the way, for this example. Ask yourself, I should have heard that signal, right? Had a premise indicator. Okay, ask yourself what are the premise, what's the premise or premises here and what's the conclusion? And oftentimes I think it's easier almost if you work backwards. So we do have a premise indicator, so maybe in this case, it's quick to just go right there and identify one of the premises. But a lot of times, if you just have a bunch of verbiage there in front of you, I think it's easiest to almost work backwards and try to start by figuring out what the issue is in general, first of all, and then, with respect to the argument, trying to highlight what the author's conclusion is. What is their position? So start there and then kind of work backwards. Okay, so this is what they're arguing for, their stance. Well, then what are the reasons that they give? You can kind of try to tease those out then. So if that's the case, what do you guys think is the conclusion here? And should state that, and we'll see all kinds of examples as we work through different examples throughout the course, the conclusion can come at the very beginning, it can come in the middle, it can come at the very end, it can come 3/4 of the way through a book where they really expound on the conclusion. So it can come anywhere, right? So again, try to find the conclusion. What is it? Well, it seems to come right at the beginning here. Okay. The part that comes before the premise indicator, which is signaling the premise about to follow, right? So our conclusion is the poor have more power than the rich. Okay, now for this to be an argument, we better have something that's given to us for believing this. Okay, some sort of evidence. Okay, maybe it's not thought to necessarily demonstrate or prove this 100%, i.e. a deductive argument. Maybe it's just thought to support it, make it more likely, i.e. an inductive argument, but one way or another. The point is we need some sort of evidence, okay? And so we do have that, right? We don't just have the position or stance on the issue. We do have, as our premise indicator suggested we would, at least one premise. Now, how many premises do we have here? We only need one, and it could be awful. It could be completely unrelated, right? It could be in a democracy, the poor have more power than the rich because your instructor is wearing a blue shirt, okay? That's still an argument. It's a terrible argument. So when we'll talk about identify, in more detail, the identification process and assessment process with respect to these arguments in the next lecture, right? In that case, you would identify that as an argument, and then you would, when you come to assess it, more importantly, right, you would say how terrible it is. One way or another, right, though, all that's needed is at least one reason that's given, okay? And we have that. It might be the case, as we have here, that there's more than one, okay? And really, you could cut it off right here. So here's one premise. There are more of them. So the idea is in a democracy, the poor have more power than the rich because there's more poor people in a democracy. That in itself is an argument, okay? It's not as good as when you include the second argument. So the idea is whoever's offering this argument, they think, hey, couple these two premises together, and then you have a good reason to think this or take this position. So, just that first premise, hey, that would still constitute an argument. It's just not nearly as good as when you add in this, right? If we also assume that this is the case, well, then this becomes a lot more likely. Okay? In fact, arguably, it has to then follow. Okay, so if we assume there are more poor people than the rich in the democracy, and the will of whoever there's more of, the majority, is going to win, well then, yeah, that seems like it would have to follow, right? That the poor are going to have more power than the rich. But here you have an example again, and within one sentence in this case, of an argument. Okay, you have two reasons given, two premises, which then coupled together, okay, constitute a lot better argument than for the or reasons or evidence for them coming to this conclusion. Okay, so this is an argument. And you then whether or not it's a good argument, that's a whole different issue, right? You'd have to go then and decide, well, if I assume these are true, does this have to be true? Excuse me. And then you go in and actually ask yourself, are these in fact true, and so on and so forth, which again we'll talk about in much more detail in the next lecture. But that's in general what the process is going to look like. Okay, pretty straightforward, but it's going to get a lot more complex and difficult when you're dealing with more complex issues and arguments. Okay. The last thing I want to talk about before concluding this lecture and turning our attention then to lecture 3 is the idea of psychological or cognitive bias. And we're all probably somewhat familiar with this, and I think I alluded to in the intro to the course video that I actually have a degree in psychology as well, and so was fairly familiar with this sort of idea or concept pretty early on in my academic career. And it's, again, as I mentioned, I think at the beginning of this video, it's always kind of fascinated me because we seem to be learning more and more that a lot of what we do is dictated and steered almost entirely by subconscious psychological tendencies or laws, or not necessarily laws, but tendencies, habits that apply to most of us, right? The majority of us just are sort of unaware of, and that it's startling in some sense, the percentage of our beliefs and behaviors, right, that seems to be the case for. And again, I tried to mention earlier how one of our jobs maybe, or really what this course is all about, is in some sense drawing more light to that, right, and making this a more explicit, conscious process, coming to these beliefs and then doing whatever behaviors we're doing based on our beliefs. Okay? So do note, as I mentioned on the top of slide 17, the various psychological or cognitive biases that the authors sort of outline. There's a lot of interesting ones there, including, this is one that's always befuddled me. I mean, it makes sense, right? That the less, how should you put it, the less smart you are, the more smart you think you are. And so that's always been intriguing to me. The people most in need are going to be the least likely to realize they have a need in the first place. That doesn't sound very hopeful. And the authors point out, right, the people that actually are most knowledgeable or experts about a particular field, they're the most likely to think of themselves as the dumbest regarding that field. And, I mean, that sort of thing's at play, and that's happening all the time. I mean, how do we even know, whether anything we're believing or doing is well justified anymore? So, well, hopefully we can, right, through this course and through philosophy in general, try to justify the things we're thinking and doing a little bit more. Okay, another one and I do draw your attention to another one on the bottom of slide 17 from page 17 of the text, where they talk about the fundamental attribution error. Another really interesting one, right, where they define it as, so this is from 17, quote, the tendency to not appreciate that others' behavior is as much constrained by events and circumstances as our own would be if we were in their position, end quote. And I think that could be spelled out a little bit better. So it's this idea that when something good happens, we are more likely to attribute it to, right, if we did it, then we're more likely to attribute it to something we ourselves did, and not to being an accident or just a reflection of outside circumstances. Whereas if somebody else, or they talk about it in terms of in-group versus out-group, but if someone else from the outside group or someone else does something good, we're more inclined to attribute that goodness to not give them credit for it. It's not something that they were responsible for, but they got lucky. They had fortunate circumstances and so on. So the same thing happening. If it's us doing it, we're more likely to assign and take personal responsibility for it when it's good, right? And it was our own doing, versus when other people are doing that same thing, we're less likely to appreciate how much they brought to the table, right? And we're more likely to assign these outside factors to it. And the opposite's true then in bad stuff. So when I do something bad, I'm a lot more likely to draw attention to all the crappy things that are happening that are then influencing that. And it wasn't my fault, right? Whereas when other people do bad stuff, we're a lot less likely to recognize the outside factors and place more of the blame on them. So that's the fundamental attribution error. So very interesting one as well. Turning to slide 18, basically, I'm going to suggest we have enough on our plates here for our purposes that we're not going to worry about knowing all those particular examples of cognitive bias. Instead, just be familiar with the general idea of psychological or cognitive bias. It's the same thing, psychological bias or biases, same thing as cognitive bias or cognitive biases. And what is that in general, or how should we think of it in a general sense? As the authors suggest on page 16 of the textbook, quote, the unconscious features of human psychology affecting belief formation. And I would say on top of that then, also affecting behavior, right? Because we do things based on our beliefs. Right? So it's the unconscious sort of elements at play in why we think what we think and why we end up doing what we're doing. And as I mentioned, it's interesting to me, it's fascinating to me because our sciences, psychology and so on, seem to bear out this notion or idea that a large portion of what we're thinking and doing is not something we're even aware of. Why it is we're doing it or why it is we're thinking it's not something that's even explicit for us or something we're aware of. It's almost on par with breathing. It's just something we naturally do and aren't conscious of. Okay, so the last thing I want to do before concluding the lecture is throw out a couple other concepts that are important here. This idea of truth, and we could spend whole courses on this, and people do. Truth and this idea of knowledge and what these amount to. Okay. Oh, so at the top of slide 19, I mentioned that we're going to just use a lot of these terms. We're going to try to simplify things. We're going to use a lot of these terms. Claims, a statement, is a judgment, it's assertion, it's a belief, opinion. For our purposes, right, they're all signaling the same thing. Something that we're convinced of that can be either true or false, and that's the important thing for us. Okay, so something about which it makes sense for us to spend some time figuring out whether it is the case, it's true, or it's not the case, it's false. Okay? Well, what do we mean by truth? And what does it mean for something to be true? Again, we're not going to dive into this too deep, right? Again, I concede, as the authors would, right, and do, that this is something you can spend entire courses on, entire lifetimes on, fleshing out what truth is in reality and what knowledge, what it actually means to know something. Okay, but what are we going to mean here? So as they point out, again, this is page 22 of our text, quote, an objective belief or claim, and that's what we're most concerned with, again, objective claims, issues, and beliefs. An objective belief or claim is either true or false in a normal common sense way. Truth and falsity are properties of propositional entities such as beliefs, opinions, judgments, statements, claims, and the like. So for our purposes, right, we're going to be asking ourselves whether these various claims, beliefs, opinions, however you want to put it, whether they're true, indicative of what really is the case, or whether they're false, not indicative of what really is the case, in that average, everyday sense. Okay? And, right, whatever's true, we come to know it, so to speak, we have this idea of knowledge. That's an entire branch of philosophy. Again, you can spend a lifetime studying just this particular branch. Not only that, but a particular issue within this particular branch of philosophy. So knowledge, remember, what was that branch? A fancy word. Okay. The fact that that is a branch of philosophy, right, should signal the notion, right, or the idea that it's not something about which we have this concrete consensus, what it means to know something. So let's acknowledge that from the outset again. So this is slide 20. There's no consensus. And I suggested this when I went through the branches of philosophy in the first lecture. What does it even mean to know something? How can we even proceed, with concern for the truth and so on, if we can't even flesh out what it would mean to come to know something, what knowledge even is in the first place? And again, this is a notorious problem. Now, in a sort of conception, and the one that the authors work with, they're saying, hey, look, we can see this is a philosophical issue notoriously. The one we're going to work with, and that, as they suggest, and correctly so, is probably by far the most popular conception of knowledge that philosophers have worked with throughout the centuries, is this idea that it's true, justified belief. Right? There's these three elements. Okay, so to be able to say you know something, that whatever it is okay, whatever claim, right, there is life after death, right? For you to say you know that, okay, it has to be something you believe, okay, otherwise how'd you know it, okay? It has to be true, or as I think the authors put it somewhere else, you have no reason to think it's false, okay? No good reason to think it's false, okay? But, and this is where a lot of the debate, I think, or I would argue, resides. You also have to be justified, okay? So you can't just, get lucky, right, and express all these claims, and they turn out to be true, and then we say, hey, you knew that was the case, okay? It turns out to be the case that, what was my example? There's life after death. So you believed it, and it turned out to be the truth, right? But did you know it if you had no reason to think it? So the justification then gets into the reasoning involved. The why. Why is it that you took up that belief? And that's where a lot of debate goes into, right? So I mentioned, I think this was in the first lecture, do you want to require this notion of certainty? 100%. You have to know 100% with certainty that that's the case. Well, then that's going to be extremely limiting on what we can say we know. Maybe even the case we don't know anything in that case. David Hume, I mentioned him. He would be one who would argue if you want to require that element of certainty in terms of when you're justified in that belief, then there's arguably very little we can know. Okay, and so that justification then, that element is where a lot of the debate resides. But they're right in pointing out, and so they talk about this in the middle of page 22, that you have a pertinent belief. This is what most people, or this is probably the most popular view, right, of what knowledge amounts to. You have a pertinent belief, and as they say, you have a justification for belief in the form of an argument, right? If you were pressed, you could provide an argument, okay? And you have no reason to suspect that it's false or that it's mistaken, okay? But no matter how you couch this, right, this has been notoriously argued as well. So Plato, I believe, is, at least I'm familiar with him bringing this. I don't know if he was technically the first one to draw this idea out of this is what it means to know something, but you get this in Plato 2,000 plus years ago. But then you get people criticizing this conception as well. I think his name was, I might be messing some of this up. It's been a while. I did take a graduate course on epistemology, but it was like 13, 14 years ago, and that's when I read these papers. He had a couple of really short but really famous papers where he poked holes in this sort of idea. He seemed to offer a case, and I might not have this completely down, but I think I have enough of it, I can recall enough of it to sort of show his issue with this, right? That there can't be something, that this can't be 100% correct, because he says, imagine, a bunch of dudes and dudettes that are applying for a job, okay? And well, I forgot his name. Let's call him Joey. Joey's one of the candidates. Okay. And Joey knows that Ralphie is another candidate. And Ralphie, very well qualified. Okay. Very well qualified. Joey knows he's a shoo-in. Ralphie's going to get it. He also saw, Ralphie put in, in the vending machine earlier, put in some money and get change back, put in his pocket. So Joey says, I know. So he says, I know the person who gets the job will have change in his pocket. Okay, so we have a belief. As it turns out, it's true. And he has a reason, he's justified for thinking this is the case, right? He saw Ralphie put the change in his pocket. But here's the kicker. Another dude named Dude actually gets the job, and as it turns out, he did also have change in his pocket. So Getty is saying, look, here's an instance where we had true, justified belief, but we don't want to say Joey knew, right, that he knew this, right? There's something strange about us conceding, just because all three of these seem to be the case, that Joey had some sort of knowledge. Wasn't he mistaken, actually? And so, again, that hints at the difficulties with respect to this, right? What does it mean to be justified? And, what that entails. And so you get all sorts of debates about that. But that's just a glimpse at how difficult this is in general. But we're going to be working with that general idea of what we mean by saying we know something is true, so far as we can tell. And we have a reason. If pressed, we can offer an argument, okay, in our class for thinking it's the case. Okay? And we obviously believe it, something that we're committed to. Okay, that's that. So we've covered a lot here in this second lecture, which corresponds again to chapter 1 of the textbook. We went through a lot of conceptual terms. We went through what critical thinking amounts to, how that's associated with reasoning and logic in particular, and how that all relates. It's kind of the methodology, of philosophy in general. Talked a lot about, what an issue is, claims and beliefs, and sort of what makes certain issues and claims objective versus subjective. Got into, in general, what an argument is and the basic building blocks of that, which looking forward to lecture 3 again, we'll flesh out in much greater detail. And then we concluded by this, but then right before that, right, talking about cognitive and psychological biases as well. So previewing in lecture 3, we're going to talk all about arguments. We're going to talk about how to identify them, which we've already hinted at, but we'll talk a little bit more again about how difficult that can be. And it seems like it's pretty straightforward and easy, on the face of things, but actually sometimes it can be a little bit more difficult than we think to discern whether or not there really is an argument, there. It's one thing to identify whether there's an argument there. We'll talk then about how to go about saying whether they're any good. And that's what we really care about, right? Never mind, yes, we want to know if there's an argument there, but should we be believing the conclusion the person's trying to convince us of? That's what we really care about, right? Is it any good? And so we'll talk then about how we ought to go about trying to assess arguments. And obviously then that's all going to hinge, as we'll talk about, on what type of argument we're dealing with. So it's one thing to talk about whether we have an argument, then we need to flesh out whether it's, a deductive argument or an inductive argument. So we'll talk about those two basic kinds of arguments, and then how to assess each of those respectively, because it will differ, and that's another important point that we will hammer home. How you go about assessing these two distinct types of arguments is going to be different, and you have to use different conceptual terms of assessment, accordingly. So we'll go through all those in much more detail and start giving some tips in terms of how to focus on the arguments themselves and get rid of or rid ourselves of all the superfluous stuff as well. And that'll be something that we continue to do for the rest of the course, elaborate on that theme as well. I guess that's it really for lecture 2 here. With that, I'll just end by showing you the chapter 1 homework if you're taking the course. And I look forward to lecture 2. Or sorry, lecture 3.